his seminal text, The Question of Palestine, published in 1979, Edward Said argues that almost total silence about Zionism doctrines, foreign treatment of the native Palestinians, is one of the most frightening cultural episodes of the 20th century. My task, he wrote there, is to present the Palestinian story. The Zionist one is much better known and appreciated, unquote. Said provided an example of breaking that silence concerning Zionism's doctrines, foreign treatment of the native Palestinians, 2 decades later in collaboration with the photographer John Mohr in After the Last Sky, through the use of photographic images for narrating the Palestinian story. However, the frightening cultural episode Said refers to does not lie solely in the silence regarding what was done to the Palestinians, including what he called the irrefutable evidence for, and I'm quoting, Israeli preventive detention, torture, population transfer, and deportation of Palestinians, Arabs, unquote. The frightening silence I would like to propose is also that concerning the way those doctrines for the treatment of the native Palestinians were embedded in the Israeli political regime without detracting much from its appearance in the eyes of its own citizens as well as in the eyes of the entire international community as a democratic sovereign regime. This silence is therefore not only about what was done to Palestinians, but also about what the perpetrators did. It is the silence of those who became perpetrators and under the current regime have lost their right not to be perpetrators forever, deprived of the capacity to acknowledge this loss of not being perpetrators. The denial and misrecognition go so deep as to deprive most Israeli Jews of their right to imagine a future where the exercise of more violence to maintain what was achieved through violence is no longer required, a right to restore their or their ancestors' homeland, Palestine, where once upon a time, before the creation of the state, they had found hospitable neighbors, a home, a shelter, a future, where they participated in the creation of a mixed and open society whose daily life was guided by coexistence rather than violence. I couldn't find my grandfather's passport, but I found a passport of the grandfather of my daughter. This is a passport of a Jewish guy who lived in Palestine for 6 generations. And this is a photo of Margot with her 2 friends, one Jew, one Palestinian, in the lake. And this is a photograph from nearby where the Tel Aviv University is today of Hawaii Coffee, run by Bidas and Ephraim Baruch. And this is a photograph of the crew of the Haifa hospital. And this is a photograph of 2 Bladerstone cases. Look at the confidence the Jewish boy has in the father of his Palestinian friend. In 2009, I assembled a photographic archive entitled From Palestine to Israel, documenting the constitutive violence by which the Jewish state was established in 1948. In and through this archive, I sought to reconstruct not only the catastrophe that affected the direct victims of that constitutive violence, but also the traces of the transformation of the catastrophe into a Palestinian-only catastrophe, an event conceived as a catastrophe from their point of view, which for Israeli Jews has become a completed past. That should never be approached without sovereign and military precautions. Thinking about the catastrophe as a Palestinian matter only implies accepting the partition of the land and of one's visual field at one and the same time as a fait accompli and as an inevitable, almost natural fact, forgetting that it is an outcome of the same violence that generated the catastrophe and was used to suppress the opposition to partition by the majority of those living in Palestine at the time. The silence of the perpetrators and their descendants and compatriots, refusing to acknowledge the destruction of Palestine in 1948 as a catastrophe, has turned into a silence about the possibility of a future in which the perpetrators will be liberated from their opposition, which under the present circumstances they seem to be doomed to occupy forever. Reading the photographs as bearing testimony for the fate of Palestinians and its Reading the photographs as bearing testimony for the fate of Palestine and its inhabitants, Palestinians and Jews alike, made it clear that the unproblematic adoption of the term war to describe that period is by itself the unproblematic adoption of the narrative of the vanquishers. The war as the apex of a long-lasting Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Jewish-Palestinian conflict eliminates the complex variety of exchange and interactions between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, replacing them anachronistically with the outcome of that period, partition, separation, and a seemingly unavoidable national conflict. The historiography of the period continues to describe the series of events that occurred in Palestine in the late 40s as a transition from war to state. And this is just one glimpse to my archive, and the effort was to juxtapose all these photos of violence with this photograph of violence, not as a transition from war to state, but the creation of the state as another form of violence. Thus, the exercise of systematic violence to create a clear Jewish majority that would correspond to and justify the formation of a Jewish state and the Judaization of state organs is still conceptualized as part of an unavoidable war between two nations and not as violence exerted against the many who insisted on continuing their life without necessarily taking sides in the national conflict that was imposed as the sole tolerated description of reality. The unquestioned adoption of military terminology, battles, operations, made insignificant the wide range of roles the army played in violating the hundreds of civil alliances among Palestinians and Jews, to which I will return in a few minutes. The civilian population can by no means be classified and identified as one of the fighting sides in a war, and the violent policies seeking to transform the politico-demographic reality in order to establish a new regime in Palestine cannot be described as a war against another army. From the photos that I included in the section headed Military Governmentality, one can construct the systematic organization of expulsion and the successive phases of its completion, the selection of population, separating the old from the young. Here you see young men. Here you see that the population that is deported, these are women and kids and old men. This is repeated in photos from various localities. The photos also indicate that in various places, the army supplied the buses. They are marked here by army, those who can read Hebrew, and made sure they reached the newly established border. In a photo from Haifa, soldiers even accomplished individuals to make sure they reached the port. And of course, all this discussion about were there an order to expel everybody or not is completely deconstructed when you look at photographs and you reconstruct the systematicity of the expulsion. But historians do not read photographs. These are entertainment usually. At Ijlil and at Lit, the army functioned as a construction contractor, imprisoning Palestinians and exploiting them as labor power. Corvée. The new and varied forms of violence exercised by the army of the newly established regime must be taken into account and weighed against the scattered battles and violent clashes between armed forces before one calls the period from November 47 to March 49 a war, be it Independence War or the War of 48. From the photographs, one can reconstruct the efforts of the new regime to undermine the possibility of a common world and civil life shared by Arab and Jews, the entire citizenry of the land. And here you see the procedure of fencing. There were not so much violence and fencing needed if the land was not mixed earlier. And here in this photograph, you can see reading, purchasing, commerce, and parking military vehicles in the area of the village is prohibited. Violators will be punished, of course, to cut any commercial exchange between Jews and Palestinians. The destructive effort was part of the whole system of military governmentality, managing the civilian population, the Palestinians certainly, but the Jews as well, with military logic. The symbiosis of military logic and civil order has characterized the Israeli regime ever since its inception and cannot be restricted to the Palestinian sector. Freedom of movement was denied Palestinians, but was controlled and administered for Israelis as well. The caption for a photo taken in Jerusalem describes this photo curfew, when in fact what we see is a lost woman, presumably Jewish, looking for answers. And as the city is under curfew, she addresses the soldier who now controls the public space and allegedly provides her security. The transformation of public space into a space mastered by military logic did not just suddenly happen. The first day of conscription to the IDF was not really a success and was therefore, you see here, there are not so many people who were drafted voluntarily to the IDF. You see here a photograph before the general draft. Tel Aviv, people not really wanted to be drafted to the army. Some of them, yes, of course, they were part of militias, but they were not the majority of people living there. So the first day was not a real success. So it was followed by a huge operation codenamed Betzer. Here you see one photograph from Betzer operation, whereby 3,200 soldiers fine-combed Tel Aviv with dogs and conducted a careful house-to-house search to flush out those who were already termed at the time draft dodgers, mishtamtim. Careful reading of these photographs, not restricted to what the picture is supposedly about, shows that military presence always means the end of civil life for Jews as well as for Arabs. Citizens quickly accepted and adopted the constraints imposed by the military on public space and the boundaries it allocated for that space. This can be illustrated, for example, by the photo from Jaffa Ghetto. And Jaffa Ghetto is not my terminology, it is, of course, terminology of the period, indicating that while Palestinians were being trained to become inmates in public space, and you see them here on this side of the fence, Jews across the road, not really far away, here on this road, Jews across the road were trained to live in the presence of people enclosed in a ghetto just because they were Arabs. The more deeply I looked at photographs from that period, the use of war as the general organizing category of the photographed situation became less and less plausible. The term itself has gradually revealed itself as an effect of the regime's power to impose its unifying logic of national enmity upon complex civil relations. But the Nakba appeared insufficient historiographically and could not frame the readings of these images of violence. It presupposes and reproduces the split between the two populations and preserves the catastrophe of 48 as as an object for Palestinian history and concern, as if Israeli Jews can continue their life without accounting for these dramatic events in their own history. And just think about Germany. The Germans will not be accounted for their history. The Nakba framework and without comparison, of course, the Nakba framework places all Jews on one side and all Palestinians on the other, ignoring the role of the Nakba in creating the national rift, as well as its destructive effects within the Jewish population. By viewing the protagonists depicted in the photos as opposing sides in a conflict, one ignores two important things. First, this view fails to account for the considerable history of common civil resistance to the violence of war all over Palestine until the very end of the 40s. Second, one ignores the force it took to silence attempts among Jews to acknowledge and condemn, or at least problematize, the overt violence of expulsion and destruction depicted in those photos. The division between Arabs and Jews as ruled and rulers did not happen all of a sudden. Look at this photo from El Nasira. The city had been captured the day before. The day before the photo was taken, women, children, and elderly remained in their homes under curfew. The elderly Palestinian man seems hesitant. He stands shrinking in his suit, while the two Palestinian women openly and vigorously gesture to the soldier. They are telling him they don't understand the curfew. They are fearlessly demanding their right to be there. Although armed, the soldier too does not react as one who clearly knows how to respond. And this moment of instability is very important to preserve and to understand, because the Jews were not born perpetrators. Otherwise, if you would not be hesitant, the Palestinians would already have been forced to return to their home, as happened in many other cases, and the soldier alone would dominate the public space. The women and the soldiers are learning their new positions, roles, and functions. The expulsion, destruction, and dispossession, and just, okay, I don't find this photo, never mind. The expulsion, destruction, and dispossession we are looking at should be questioned as affecting the whole population, victims and perpetrators alike, as well as generations of later spectators. For this, a new type of visual grammar is needed, an exercise of active-passive modes of viewing, in a way that anything that can be said about Palestinians, they were deported, they were dispossessed, they were deprived of citizenship, should be inversely about Israeli Jews. They deported Palestinian, they expelled Palestinian, they deprived them of citizenship, while establishing their citizenship. Otherwise, the Israeli citizenship cannot be understood. Only with this to and from movement could a common ground of violence that should be transformed, only then a common ground would be possible, out of which a potential history can be drawn. When we narrate the Nakba and the independence, a common ground cannot be reconstructed. Thus, when photographs of the violence from the years 47-48 are carefully read, both protagonists appear as part of the same history that cannot be narrated separately. Both appear in their mode of becoming victims or perpetrators. From this perspective, their fateful trajectories appear inseparable, and the partition of their history into two national narratives becomes an unproblematic acceptance of partition, not merely as a political fact, but also as an unsurpassable historiographic framework. Constitutive violence cannot be undone without redeeming both victims and perpetrators, which the present regime keeps producing as ready-made positions for Palestinians and Israeli Jews. In 2007, in Yael Bartana's film Mari Koshmari, Nightmares, a Polish intellectual addressing the Jews, calling them, "Come, let us live together. Let us be different, but not harm each other." In his speech, Slavomir Sikorski emphasizes the nightmare that haunt Poles ever since their land was ethnically cleansed of Jews. And let me show you 30 seconds of this film.
Żydzi, rodacy, ludzie! Myślicie, że ta stara kobieta, która wciąż śpi pod pierzyną rybki, nie chce was widzieć? Zapomniała o was? Mylicie się! Ona śni o was każdej nocy. Śni i drży ze strachu.
The possible return of Jews to Poland is not merely the renewed possibility of Jewish life in Poland, but rather the renewed possibility of life together, revived out of the ruins of ethnic cleansing. The negation of ethnic cleansing is to serve as a basis for new partnership. Although this work focuses on Jewish-Polish context, its scope is wider by far. Ever since I heard it, this speech has haunted me relentlessly with its repercussions on other political contexts, and most particularly the local context of Palestine. It resounded in my head until one day it emerged in my own language as an address to Palestinians. Only with you, Palestinian, women and men, by force of our common demand to be governed equally, can the state embody its proper, favorable dimensions, a neutral framework upheld by the governed and for their sake. Neither negotiations nor conditions, neither peace treaties nor transition phases, but a basic demand by the governed and by those who have been expelled from the sphere of governance to be counted and be a part, to become citizens, imagining their future, reinstating political partnership. Palestinian women and men, I repeated in my imagination, until a certain day it was no longer a matter of imagining a future, but of reconstructing it from the past that had to be imagined anew. This happened when, to my big surprise, while trying to locate in the archive a single civil contract between Jews and Palestinians, mentioned in a single line of a book by Benny Morris published in '89, the famous refugee problem, calling the refugee problem, I found hundreds of documents recording such contracts signed in Palestine in the years 47-48. I learned that intensive civil activity has taken place throughout the country at the time and was completely ignored by historians. Its removal from historical narrative supported the retroactive depiction of '48 war as the culminating of a long-lasting national conflict. The civil activity, whose amplitude I had just begun to reconstruct, included urgent encounters, some short and spontaneous, others planned in advance and carefully designed in detail, whose Palestinian and Jewish participants raised demands, sought compromises, set rules, formulated agreements, made promises, asked for forgiveness, made efforts to reconcile and compensate, and did everything possible not to let violence take over their lives. They did their utmost to halt the violence that national and military forces were intent on igniting, and negotiated with each other in order to create mutual civil alliances. This tremendous civil effort continued during the constitutive violence that was practiced in Palestine between 47 and 49, making obsolete the efforts of citizens to imagine their future outside the dictates of the nation-state. In the nascent global order, consolidated and implemented in the final months of the Second World War, such civil activity was doomed, outcast, and replaced by a nation-state member of the UN. The pairing up of citizenship and national self-determination with forced migration and the creation of non-citizens and impaired citizens was presented as necessary means to reduce the prospects of new national conflicts and was part of a new international order that emerged from the Second World War. Unsurprisingly, as these solutions were conceived and achieved by international organizations, resolutions, and state powers in almost any geographical territory where such a solution was implemented, the conflict that it was supposed to pacify was either generated by such implementation or enhanced and exacerbated. The pile of documents I found in the Haganah archive relating to the period between November 47, the partition plan, and May 48, the creation of the state, emerged slowly, not only as a missing chapter of local history, but also as traces of its missing geography. The map these documents help to reconstruct differs from those relatively familiar maps of Palestine before the Nakba, where Palestinian towns and villages are represented almost exclusively. It is rather a map of a mixed and shared space cohabited daily by Palestinians and Jews, which the constitutive violence systematically ruined. The destruction of Palestine included the erasure of this map, of this shared map. Its reconstruction had to rely on scattered information drawn from what came to be two different and parallel geographies. When I began to locate the places where these Jews and Arabs met and talked in urgent ad hoc encounters, or in others planned in detail and well in advance, I realized that these places were ubiquitous, spreading all over Palestine, but it took many hours of painstaking research to determine the exact location of all these meeting places. I then invited 25 Arabs and Jews of varying age groups, each of them capable of speaking both Arabic and Hebrew, to gather around the reconstructed map and recite these encounters, reiterate the language of the agreements reached and promises made by our ancestors in hundreds of villages and towns during this period. There are conflicting desires and dreams. There are strife and miseries. There are conflicts and disagreements of their time emerge, and in the absence of a sovereign, they were compelled to use language differently, to use it with a civil grammar, the grammar that precludes exclusion. And let me show you a few minutes from the film. And I'm very glad that one of the participants is here with me.
בית איקסה. בית איקסה. תושבי בית איקסה התנגדו בתקיפות לכניסה של לוחמים ערביים לכפרם, וסירבו להפוך אותו לבסיס צבאי.
Should I read the subtitles for you? They read the name of each locality in Hebrew and Arabic. Bet Safafa. The villagers called for help and the Arab party. They reply and they I cannot.
لم تعد القرية تحت سلطة أهلها وإنما في سلطة أبناء الشعب وخيار النزوح عن القرية يتعلق بهم. عارض السكان بشدة دخول مقاتلين مسلحين إلى القرية ودفعوا ثمن ذلك حياتهم وهدم عدد من منازلهم.
נהריה תרשיחא.
נהריה תרשיחא.
בפגישה הראשונה לשיפור יחסי שכנות בין יהודים לערבים, הודגשו היחסים הטובים ביניהם. דוקטור הירש הציע שרופאים יקבלו חולים עניים מהכפרים הסמוכים ללא תשלום, והווטרינר הציע לתת הרצאות ולהדריך בעלי בקר כיצד להילחם במחלות. ראש מועצת תרשיחא הזמין את המשתתפים לארוחת צהריים.
بيت جبرين في مسجد في وادي حنين وأمام 500 شخص خطب الشيخ عبد الرحمن بمناسبة عيد المولد النبوي، وأيد في خطبته التعاون العربي اليهودي لمحاربة العدو المشترك السلطة البريطانية.
Okay. We'll stop here because you cannot read the translation, but it goes hundreds of stories when, for example, in one village they don't have a vet, so the Palestinians' neighbors invite the Jews to bring their animals. In the Jewish locality they have a school, they invite Palestinians to bring their kids in school, and they find solutions. There was a pig that was stolen, and there is a question how to give it back. They promise each other that if militia, Jews or Palestinians, will come to their village, they will not collaborate with it. And in the most stunning contract that was signed between Deir Yassin and Givat Shaul, and I'm speaking about this really as an amazing contract because all of us know the Deir Yassin massacre, and there was an amazing contract full of details, how they will hang laundry in their balcony in order to signal to the neighbors in the other village that militias are coming and trying to mobilize them to violence. And of course, Deir Yassin, there was a big massacres, but those who infringed the contract were not the residents or the inhabitants of Givat Shaul. And I think it is very important to pay attention to that. Those vehement joint efforts that unfortunately you couldn't really follow, but you saw the ritual that they are learning together the new geography. We are learning together. Those vehement joint efforts of Jews and Arabs to preserve their shared life, find peaceful solutions to conflicts and disputes, reach compromises, be mutually attentive to needs, make agreements and promises, all these did not cease once violence erupted. These efforts lasted even while some of the agreements were not observed. In most cases, promises were broken not by the inhabitants themselves, but rather by members of national militias who tried, national militias, I'm speaking of course about Ben-Gurion and other, not militias in the eyes of Ben-Gurion, who tried to impose a new political reality upon the land. In May 1948, the founding of the State of Israel put an end to this mutual recognition by Jews and Arabs of their responsibility for their shared life. The new sovereign rule replaced the old civil rules of the game with new national ones. Under the new rule, this civil chapter of history was erased. The little that was known of efforts to promote civil treaties was presented in a negative light, in the ruling perspective through which civil partnership appears as collaboration, namely an act of national treason. A civil reading of documents recording the mutual efforts collected in the Haganah archive yield a complex, vital picture full of hope and faith in the power of shared life. By the way, you can view the whole film on YouTube. This picture cannot be reduced to the national narrative that began to be constructed from May 1948 and projected hopeless polarity and hostility onto the past. During those numerous encounters and negotiations, the participants raised demands, sought compromises, set rules, formulated agreements, made promises, sought forgiveness, made efforts to compensate and reconcile. Their shared purpose was to keep violence from taking over their lives. They sought to protect the common world of their life in Palestine and salvage it from those who wished to destroy it. In over 100 documented encounters, and probably many more whose records have yet to be restored. They promise themselves and each other the continuation of their shared lives. This archival material, foregrounded by the film, has been kept dormant in state archives. The film frames these documents as an important chapter in local history and geography that has been erased from history books to enable the hegemonic historical narrative of an enduring Arab-Jewish conflict. Gathered together, these stories are presented for the first time as significant common civil efforts of Jews and Palestinians. The presence of two cameramen mingling with the speakers and shooting them, being captured by a third camera fixed in the ceiling, embodies the fact that these were exciting news developing and persisting day after day for half a year, and their outcome was not foreknown. The film ends as the map is covered by hundreds of white dots embodying the extent of the agreements spread throughout Palestine. It rejects the narrative of inevitable war between two homogeneous sides and insists on reproducing numerous, rich models of conflict resolution that were practiced in Palestine until shortly before the creation of the state, also contradicting the image of communities whose sole interest is to dispossess each other and risk their lives in a spiraling escalation of violence. And when I'm speaking about half a year, this is what the film is focused on, but these mutual agreements and compromises were in Palestine since the Jewish migration into Palestine. I just focused on the crucial half year when violence was already in the air and implemented. The film reconstructs, or while international permission was given to this violence with the partition plan. The film reconstructs the historical moment when Palestinians and Jews together as equal partners sought ways to maintain and protect their shared life in the same territory, and when local conflicts eventually emerged, they found ways to solve them. To Edward Said's formulation of imperialism as theory and colonialism as practice, sovereign citizenship, like the Israeli citizenship, should be added as historiography and the vantage point. Much has been written about the theory and practice about colonialism being a lever for acquisition of more and more land, money, manpower. Too little, however, has been written about differential citizenship that dictated colonial historiography and to a large measure also shaped the horizon of anti-colonialist position. This historiography is based on the national sovereign delineation that dictate the boundaries of narrated history as national history, often demarcated from the geopolitical context in which it unfolded. Thus, for example, for about 200 years, the French and American revolutions were studied as national events, isolated from the Atlantic context in which they took place. While the history of the State of Israel was written as detached from Palestinian history, as though the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe, happened by itself and is an internal Palestinian affair, and as though the declaration of the State of Israel, the violence that became law, indeed created a distinct time-space unit whose Jewish Israeli rulers can also rule the history that will be told of and about it. Out of such historiography, peoples and their international supporters, wishing to be liberated of the bonds of colonialism, could hardly imagine liberation that does not entail national self-determination and the replication of the sovereign citizenship model. Time has come for Palestinians to return to Palestine. Time has come to Israeli Jews and Palestinians to claim Palestine together, not Palestine as an opposition to Israel. It is time for Israeli Jews to cease the reproduction of violence, maintaining the consequences of the constitutive violence of 48 that made Israeli Jews citizens and Palestinians non-citizens or non-governed of their homeland. Non-governed is my terminology for the refugees. Time has come for Israeli Jews to recognize the constitutive disaster, the Nakba, not only as a Palestinian catastrophe, but as a catastrophe in the production of which they are implicated on a daily basis. Time has come for the second generation of perpetrators, and I consider myself to be a second generation, descendants of those who expelled Palestinians from their homeland, to claim our right, our fundamental and inalienable right, the right not to be perpetrators. Without this fundamental right, one can never be a citizen governed equally with others. Thank you.
Fred, thank you so much for this beautiful speech. We know each other for so long, but I never heard you in this position, so thank you for that. I want to add two things in your direction and then to ask a question. One, there is really the beautiful poem of Avot Yeshurun that is said that the Holocaust of the Jews in Europe and the Holocaust of the Arabs in Palestine, both of them are the Holocaust of the Jew. Both of them look at him together in his eyes. So there was this understanding that it's part of the Jewish Nakba, the Nakba. But the issue that I feel is the impossibility maybe of your call, or like as we said, the impossibility of forgiveness. And when Yael is speaking about coming back to Poland, it's in a whole different situation. I felt it because I'm going to speak about it later. In 2001, I went to ask Chairman Arafat forgiveness. And he told me the same story, how you used to pray with the Jews and pray with the Jews in the Wailing Wall before 48. But from this moment of all those treaties, something changed. And history happened in the same time, I think, and the same way that the Nakba really happened in 67 when we repeat the Nakba. I'm afraid that maybe today to have this call, please come, or working together today is not working before the Nakba. Because maybe today the only thing we can do is Israeli Jews to join the Palestinian to their struggle, because the forgiveness cannot be happen, or the call cannot be happen by us giving up what is not ours. Maybe the first step for the togetherness is first to join the oppressed totally, and only from this position after to try to join the call together. It's two different options. And
thank you very much. If we just collect some of the comments and questions, and please, again, a request to be as brief as possible given the time, but I think the next question is here. And then here, so we've three.
Ariella, it's hard to get out of the urge to just applaud that wonderful talk and actually ask a question. But I'd like to just ask you to say a little bit more about what exactly you intend and mean by the fascinating idea of the right not to be a perpetrator. That is, what sort of right is that? I mean, is it a right that derives from the fact that being a perpetrator is something that you, in the second generation anyway, to which you declare yourself as being, is simply inherited? And so you want, simply inherited, so you want to move it to something which is not an inheritance, but a matter of moral and legal optionality. Is that the idea behind calling it a right? So just explain a little bit more what you mean by the right not to be a perpetrator and what it derives from. What's the contrast which makes it a right?
Okay, thank you very much. And now, Robert Young.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that absolutely wonderful, impassioned talk. which was really illuminating. I just wanted to give a footnote, if you like, to a phrase I think you said was something like seemingly doomed to occupy forever.
Sorry?
Seemingly doomed to occupy forever. You said something like that. And I just wanted to draw people's attention to an extraordinary film that's just come out in London called The Gatekeepers, where there are 6 former heads of Shin Bet, the Israeli security force, who've actually been the people in charge of occupation. Each one actually talks about their role as directing, as it were, security and in the West Bank and Gaza, and each one actually says that it's unsustainable, and actually that there has to be a negotiated solution. So I'm just keen that we shouldn't accept that doom for occupying forever, and it's very interesting that even the heads of Shin Bet actually, having carried out their tasks in reflection afterwards, feel that occupying forever is simply not an option.
Okay. Thank you. We'll just have one last very brief question, please, there, and then I will ask you to
Hello,
to
thank you
respond.
very much for your beautiful speech. I have a question
If you can
about...
speak louder, I don't know why.
Thank you for your beautiful speech. I wondered if we spectators need to be emancipated, or and if so, do we get emancipated by looking at photographers, at photos? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for these questions. I hope that I'll be able to respond to. I'll start from the last one. It's very easy. The answer is no. We're not getting emancipated by viewing photographs, even not by reading them very carefully. We're not getting emancipated. But I think that we have a responsibility while looking at photographs, because photographs are produced in different moments, and the photographs that I am looking at were produced in moment of constitutive violence. And looking at photographs of constitutive violence, our role usually is to do what Walter Benjamin would call, in complementary with constitutive violence, is to preserve the law. And if we will look at these photographs and we would say, yeah, this is a refugee, look at him, this is a refugee, a Palestinian refugee, as if the Palestinians were born refugees, I think that we are preserving the law, the violence that became law. So I think that we have a certain role to say that this is not a Palestinian refugee, this is a person that was expelled from his homeland. And we have to look also carefully not what was done to him, but what these people are doing, and while they are doing that, what they are denying, and when we speak only about what was done to Palestinians, we forget about the perpetrators. And I think that without accounting for the perpetrators, we will never be, I don't know if emancipated, but the occupation or whatever, or the Israeli regime will last forever. So I think that we have a certain responsibility when we are using political categories that were given to us by the ruling regime when we are looking at photographs. So I thought this is a simple answer, but maybe it was too long. I'll go to the other 2 questions, actually, because you did a comment, and thank you for it. And I think that there is somehow a relation between your both questions. So I'll try to answer, not that the questions are the same, but it leads me to the same place. From where can we claim rights? And what Udi is suggesting here, and he suggested it 2 or 3 years ago when I tried in Tel Aviv during the civil awakening, there was in Rothschild Boulevard, there was Tent 48 initiated by Palestinian and Mizrahi Jew. And in this tent and through email correspondence with a dozen of people, I suggested, let's think about forgiveness. And I was insulted as if I really wanted to take from Palestinians or from us the struggle against the occupation. So I think that when I'm speaking about forgiveness, or when I'm speaking about anticipating the future and reading it from the past, creating what I call potential history, what I have in mind is not Bibi Netanyahu asking forgiveness from Arafat or from Abu Mazen, etc. I mean, I don't care neither about the one or the other. When I'm speaking about forgiveness, I don't speak about forgiveness in terms of gift, in the way that Yankelevich or Derrida would speak about it. I'm speaking about forgiveness as a process of learning together the past. And forgiveness is not to forgive for the deeds. I think that the deeds, the expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland, is unforgivable. So for me, forgiveness is a process where both Jews and Palestinians would recognize this as unforgivable. But recognizing it together as unforgivable is creating a new bond, a new basis for a new civil contract. And to formulate it as a response to you, Akil, I would say that for years, and Rancière wrote about it, and Arendt, of course, that when we are speaking about human rights, we are speaking about the rights of the rightless. We are speaking about the rights of others. And for years, as Israeli Jew, we spoke about the rights of Palestinians not to be under occupation, and 10, 15 years ago, we started to understand the Nakba. We didn't knew about the Nakba. And I must say that also, many of the Palestinian Israelis didn't know about the Nakba because their family kept it also in withdrawal from them. We started to know about the Nakba when the Nakba became more public as a memory that we have to work on it. The Nakba, Konstantin Zurek, of course, wrote about it in 1948. Palestinians who suffered the Nakba knew about the Nakba, but I'm speaking about knowing it as part of your political discourse. So we spoke about the rights of others. But I think that we cannot allow ourselves to speak about the rights of others, or at least not only about the rights of others, because when we speak about the rights of others, it's as if our citizenship is really the most wonderful thing, that Palestinians had to strive to be part of it. I think that we Israeli Jews, we have to reconceive our citizenship, and we won't be able to do it without Palestinians. So I think that there is a common struggle here without erasing the differences, without erasing the different prices that was paid. No comparison, of course, between Palestinian refugee and me. But I think that I cannot give up on Palestine. As Palestine, my family lived in Palestine. The family of my partner lived in Palestine. And Palestine is something that I want to claim, not Palestine of Palestinians as it is conceived in the national terms, Palestine of pre-partition, Palestine where nobody owned it. And Udi told me, we cannot claim what doesn't belong to us, but Palestine doesn't belong to Palestinian either. What is this idea that a land belongs to someone? And I would repeat maybe Robert Young's formulation from yesterday from Said, in relation to Said, that we belong to Palestine. So I think that all this notion of ownership is something to deconstruct. Palestinians had many rights and claim to this place, but these cannot erase my claim to Palestine of pre-partition. So coming back to Akil, sorry that I did a bypass back to Udi. So it's not claiming the rights of others, it's claiming the right not to be a perpetrator, because I still want to work through the discourse of citizenship and through the discourse of human rights. And willing to work through these discourses, I'm going to the constitutive moments of those discourses. And in 1948, when the expulsion of Palestinians took place, there were the discussion at the UN about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We got not only Israeli Jews, not only Palestinians, the whole world, the whole system of nation state. We got this Universal Declaration of Human Rights already with its violation, because during the discussions, Ralph Bench, who was the representative of the UN in Palestine, he came and he reported what took place there. And the Iraqi representative asked to stop the discussions and let's speak about that. And of course, it was erased from the discussions, and we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights already with its violation, and Israel was accepted to the UN in 1949 as a peace lover state. So I think that for me it is very important to go back to this constitutive moment of our modern human rights discourse, and from this moment to create a potential history. And maybe just to finish with one image. Palestine is a symptom of the New World Order, but Palestine is also a hope, because the nation state was not materialized in Israel. Not only the Palestinian doesn't have a state, Israel is not the full materialization of the nation state, because as long as Palestinians claim to be included in Palestine, the Israeli nation state is unstable. So Palestine, for me, if you look at this map, which is the map of the joining states into the UN on different phases, there is one point here, which is unstable, red one. So this place, full of suffering, but is still a place of hope, out of which we can maybe imagine a different social or a different civil contract among the governed population, which will be a civil contract that will not be imposed by the New World Order that was conceived in the 40s and promoted the solution of self-determination for the Jews and forsaken Palestinians to be the non-citizens. And maybe I didn't answer, but thank you.